I need some traction.
Hey everyone, Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder of Traction. Today's Traction webinar is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy and Duplo Cloud. Duplo Cloud is a one-stop shop solution for all your DevOps, cloud automation, and compliance needs, from infrastructure provisioning and application deployment to security controls, compliance certification, and alerts. Get 2 months free access by contacting info@duplocloud.com. That's DUPLOCLOUD.com. I am in Austin today. Katrina, where are you tuning in from?
I'm in Sausalito, California, just right outside of San Francisco.
Awesome, cool. And we're one of the last sessions here before the big conference in Vancouver, which I'm super excited about. And next time, we'd love to have you there in person. But great session today here. Exciting topic of demand gen, especially during a downturn, right? It's tough markets. All the boards and companies are saying, stay default alive. Let's see how you continue to grow without spending any money. And our awesome speaker here, Katrina Wong, is the VP Marketing at Twilio Segment. She's going to share the playbook of doing that. How do you do demand gen with minimal budget? How do you go from 0 to 100 million and beyond? We're going to go into channels, demand, brand, team, tools, and metrics. From her experience helping 3 companies scale from pre-IPO to post-IPO. Katrina, welcome to Traction. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Awesome. So you've had a very successful career as a marketing leader. Give us your backstory. How did you get to where you are today?
Thank you. I started my career in consulting at PwC quite a while back, and I really was able to hone my customer-facing skills. And I basically developed this knack for a customer-first mindset. So eventually that led to my first marketing role in customer marketing, which then evolved into a role in integrated campaigns. And so I would say that my first actual job in demand gen was under Teen, who is the CEO, co-founder of Sora. And it started because he asked me to lead a voice of the customer campaign. In terms of where I am today, as Lloyd mentioned, I'm at Twilio Segment. And during COVID, of all things, at the beginning of COVID, was when we got acquired by Twilio. And Peter at the time, founder and CEO of Segment, I still remember this day so clearly. He let me know, and he was like, hey, I've decided to sell the company. And my heart just dropped, because I was like, Peter, this is my first year into the role, and we were just getting started on our journey. But to fast forward today, it's been really nice because at Twilio, albeit a much larger business and a public company, we are still innovating. And the builder mindset is so core to our values. So Twilio, honestly, as a company, is still so entrepreneurial. And that was an instant match for Segment. So in fact, Jeff, the CEO and founder of Twilio, when he and Peter first met, one of the first things they discussed was each company's core values, and in fact, how similar they were. So for example, we're both, API first and developer first companies. And it's just been so great operating with that mindset. And anyway, to make a long story short, here at Twilio Segment, we actually have more resources, more budget to achieve our goal. And we'll touch on that as times are starting to change, as Lloyd mentioned.
Definitely. So prior to Segment, you were at Hired, Zora, Salesforce, SAP, some big companies there, hyper growth as well. What was it like, though, getting acquired by Twilio? I mean, you shared some of this, but what is it like going from a startup to a bigger company? You have more resources. That's one, but then the market is going down and budgets are getting cut. What is the feeling? What is the sentiment?
I think all companies are starting to make contingency plans. So most of us have not put that into action yet. So my budget, just to be clear, hasn't, been cut yet. But what we're looking to do is what motions do we put in place, assuming that top of the funnel kind of dries up and, you're going to have a smaller budget. So, we can get into some of this, but the outbound motion using ABM, for example, will be a bigger lever for those of us, in the business of building demand for companies.
Definitely. Now, before we get into the session today, why don't you introduce us to Twilio Segment? What does Segment do? What is it all about?
Absolutely. I can keep this short. Recently, IDC has put this out, right? We've been ranked as the world's #1 CDP platform, which stands for Customer Data Platform. And so if you're new to, what we do, we help companies collect, unify, and activate their customer data so that companies can create seamless, compelling customer experiences. And the key is in real time. So some of our top, customers, companies like Levi's and Domino's, right? They primarily use us to decrease the cost of acquisition, their CAC, and increase their LTV, lifetime value.
Definitely. Now, some of the greatest innovations and trends come out of downturns, right? I believe that pain is the precondition for growth. What do you see as the biggest trend coming out of all of this that'll change the way marketing is done today?
Great question, because some of these larger companies that you mentioned that I've worked for were actually either founded during a recession like Zora, and actually Twilio as well. Segment, exited, on the brink of the pandemic. So in addition to what we're seeing at a macro level, the macroeconomic level, one of the biggest trends right now, or biggest, situations is this conversation about first-party data versus third-party data. And this debate has recently truly heightened because as marketers, we know that third-party cookies are going away by the end of 2023. So even though it's been this topic for years and some of us in the industry have actually framed it as its privacy, personalization paradox, right? My point of view is that this paradox doesn't really exist, right? We're so lucky. We now have the technology to be just as effective in marketing with first-party data. You just need to know what data to collect and how to instrument to collect it. And so, I actually love how the bar is so much higher for marketers now. And I think many of us have always wanted to be customer forward, consumer forward, privacy first, and at the same time provide the best experiences. We just didn't have the technology to do so, and now we can.
So now with first-party data being everything and third-party cookies going away, the focus is going to be on, do you own the direct relationship with the customer? Communities, lots of focus on communities. What legacy marketing tactic do you think will fade away?
Great question. I actually think the traditional cold calling outbound motion has been fading away. I think that's going to go away, period, right? Because of course you need to do outreach, but you should be, to your point, building a community and curating an audience where they're just warmed up for the demand that you're looking to build, right? And in other words, right, what value are you providing to your audience, to your community, to your future customers? Are they learning something from engaging with you? Are the experiences you're building compelling? Because that's the value exchange. As a marketer, I think about it, for every person's time that I'm asking, are they benefiting from it? And if it's no, then you haven't quite figured out the give to get. And we got to give first as marketers.
Definitely, I completely agree. You also talked about ABM, which is account-based marketing. But let's first get the definitions right. People say demand, people say marketing, people say growth. What is the difference?
Oh,
Because
yes, great
for most
question.
founders, it feels the same, right? We're hiring and we're investing, and we make mistakes because as founders, especially tech-focused founders, we think all marketing is the same. And hiring the wrong kind of person, like for example, you hire a brand marketer in the early stages, but you really need to get leads, right? And that could be detrimental.
Yeah.
So what is that difference between demand versus marketing versus growth?
Great question. I actually get asked this exact question from a lot of founders. There's some technical differences, and I'll also maybe dive into some potential traps. I call them hiring traps. But demand, and I really learned this from Tina at Zora, it's creating a market that comes to you versus chasing after a market. We can talk tactics, and I'm sure Lloyd will get into that. But the net of it is it's a lot harder when you chase after a market. Marketing, right, is a broad umbrella, and honestly, right, the art, marketing is now a science for sure. There's the art to it, right? The art of marketing, honestly, is what approach are you taking that works for your business, that fulfills the need for a customer, and what are those tactics? So it's very, very broad, right? And growth, when this term started popping up quite a few years ago, I loved it because it made sense, because you want to specify a sub-function of your marketing efforts that's directly tied to your end results, right? Your customer acquisition efforts need to be tied to growth. These days, I think in terms of the definition, it's generally closely associated with product-led growth, which in itself is a fascinating topic. Yeah.
Certainly. Awesome. So let's get right into it then. In terms of you're a new founder, where do you start? How do you set up your demand to get more leads? What if you had like only 10K, for example?
Yes, some real life examples. I advise a good number of startups, and I typically share this. I've led 3 early stage startups in the past as the first VP of marketing and then building a team. So I used to say this a ton, you absolutely cannot cheat as a startup. Like every minute and every dollar matters, because your run rate is set, right? And so honestly, every minute and every dollar is so precious. So when I talk to founders about this and where to get started, my first piece of advice is think about your distribution. A lot of founders hire marketers, and they're just doing a small piece of it. They're creating content, they're sending emails, right? They're doing basic demand gen, but they're not thinking about distribution. And if you don't have a large budget, you really can't spend on paid for distribution, right? So one of the first questions I ask them is, who is your audience, and who else is targeting that exact same audience but isn't competitive with your product or service? So for example, when I was hired, we were a hiring platform. We basically match engineers with hiring managers, and we targeted VPs of talent, HR, and we partnered with other HR systems, HR software companies, but they were always an entirely different product, Greenhouse, for example. So if you're low on budget, what you want to do are joint webinars and just joint marketing efforts where you're tapping to your database, they're tapping to their database, and whenever, like, whoever responds and engages with your joint content, right, both companies will follow up. And then the follow-up question is, well, I don't really have a database yet, because I'm trying to for example, go to Greenhouse, and I'm a small startup. I just don't even have that. So what do I have to offer? Well, guess what? Thought leadership. You always have that, even if you don't have a database. And for example, at Hire, we partnered with all of the ATS systems, and what we ended up doing was leveraging our data. We had a lot of hiring data on diversity, so it wasn't necessarily about our database. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Like, what unique insight do you have on that ideal customer profile? And you sort of get the brand rub of a bigger brand. In many ways, we did that at Traction, right? In the early days, we
Mhm.
had nobody. We started as pizza nights. And I found that rather than cold emailing people to sell a product, it's easier to invite them to something of value. And then
That's right.
you invite a speaker that has a brand. And our first event, we had Jeff Lawson there speaking, and so the brand of Jeff Lawson drove the audience. And then you keep doing that on a cadence, and your list just grows. And over
That's
time,
right.
from 10 people showing up to a pizza night to 500 people showing up to the first conference where or Twilio CEO Jeff spoke, to today we're 110,000 subscribers, and that took like 5-6 years. But then doing that one thing consistently well kept driving the audience. So huge kudos there, and I've experienced that firsthand. What are the key elements of an effective marketing strategy for startups? Maybe drive into demand, brand growth, everything. Like, how do you uh, figure out your marketing strategy, and what do you put and prioritize in there?
Thank you for this question. I'm no longer at like an earlier stage startup, but it is so fun at startups because you really do get to tell the founder story. And so what you alluded to, Lloyd, which is, that hook of Jeff Lawson early on as you were building up traction, it's the same idea, right? Like the founder story is the hook for PR, for example. And then in terms of like demand, brand, growth, product, all these things, right? They typically get integrated into a product launch of some sort. And when you do this product launch, right, one way to think about it is, I'm going to tell the founder story. That's my hook, and fold in the PR, piece of it. And there's a couple of techniques, right? Sometimes you can just lead with founder story. Sometimes you're leading with, the David versus Goliath method, right? Like you're disrupting the status quo, right? And then you actually do the product launch, and then you pull through with everything else, like your content, your webinars, right? Written content. And if you can, right, to your point, the cadence, if you can repeat it every quarter, right? Every quarter and a half, right? You're going to be surprised by how much your product launches are these super special moments where you just hook everyone in. And the more like thought leadership you provide, and the more value you provide about solving the problem that your customer needs to be solved, and you're educating them along the way, the more engagement you're going to get, right? And it, to your point, it may take a little bit, but it actually does work. But it's about coupling quite a few different marketing levers, right? And not just doing one, not just doing webinars, and not just doing your blog posts.
Definitely. Now, what are some levers that you think are worth looking at, like tactics wise specifically?
I still think, believe it or not, for really compelling content, email is still king, right? People are still getting emails, they are still opening them up, and they're still reading compelling content. So I don't give up on email marketing, life cycle marketing, re-engagement stuff, the newsletter stuff, right? Adding a subscribe button there. Webinars are kind of your table stakes, right? You need to be able to present content in a compelling way, whether it's a fireside chat like this or a how-to video, whatever it might be. Those are still my kind of go-to staples for sure.
Certainly. Now, if you had to cut budget, what is your playbook here? What are some most uncuttable budget items?
This begs a question of, right, because I'm a huge proponent of integrated campaigns, because I think if you just do one channel, one type of tactic, you get channel fatigue. It just doesn't really work, right? And so the idea of an integrated campaign is you have a hook, and each tactic layers on top of that. So you get what I call the 1 + 2 equals 10 effect. So when I think about all of that, maybe you hold back on, your paid, but what's uncuttable for me is content, because without content, you're not going to be able to actually do any distribution, and none of your tactics work. So that for me is a non-negotiable.
And so when you talk about content, how should we think about formulating a content strategy? Because everyone's throwing out white papers and webinars and ebooks and there's dozens of podcasts here, right? There's a lot of noise. So how do you formulate that strategy?
I get close. It goes back to my roots. What is the customer mindset and what are they looking for? So you should have, right, like a map of your funnel and what content aligns up to what part of the funnel, and what the compelling event is from somebody moving it. Like, I'm just looking for education, so it's like content 101. Now I want to go deeper, right? And it's content 201. What exactly do I need to do to get the result that you're promising me? Right. So we've gone as far as doing RFP guides for CDP. I mean, that is our space, right? And, kind of in B2B business selling, you got to go pretty deep so that you're actually taking the leverage, like you're taking the hard work of a stakeholder needing to build a business case internally to buy your product. You're taking that off their plate, and you're actually serving that up. That's one of our highest convertible assets. I think top of the funnel, 10 ways to do something where the product just kind of gets wrapped in, not product for the sake of product, kind of works. But, on the higher side, what was really interesting is we just had so much data on engineering salaries, pay equity, diversity. It was never about just selling hired for the sake of hired. Like, we saw it as a service, to the community. We're like, we need to get the education out so that we can solve some of these social problems. Like, pay equity is real. And a lot of the, other types of data available were based on surveys, and ours were actual, data points that were obviously anonymized, right? So again, it's kind of to stand out from the noise, you have to be pretty compelling. And the way to get there is to build that hook and deeply understand your customer. Yeah, that's the art of marketing.
Definitely. So like truly understanding your ideal customer profile, what are the pains they're facing, and then serving value via content. And it could be webinars, it could be long form content, blog posts, even meetups, to drive that value
right.
to them on a continuous cadence. So you're constantly top of mind across channels. Now, you said cold emailing shouldn't be your main outbound prospecting strategy, or it's going to fade away. If not cold calling, if it's not cold calling, cold emailing, then what should be and why?
We have a lot of data internally, and upwards of over 70% of outbound that we do, the prospect has actually engaged with some piece of marketing, whether it's like they've attended an event, right? So it's been really interesting to see. So I think if you're just email account, they've never heard of you, it's a much harder route. Certainly if you're calling and leaving voicemails, that's a much, much harder route. So think of marketing as one big nurture engine. You're there to educate, right, along the journey. And when you're doing outbound, you're not truly doing it cold, right? We're here to help and educate and basically warm up the ecosystem, right? Like, I just honestly don't think cold outbounding in whatever channel, whether it's calling or emailing, actually exists. I think you're going to be a lot more effective if they've heard of you first and you've given them an opportunity to learn about your product in an interesting way.
Definitely. Now let's switch to paid tracks, right? Paid social, SEM. It feels like it gets twice as much expensive to squeeze the same ROI from these. What are your thoughts here? How do you become more effective, and do you even need to do this?
I do caution for startups, your budgets have to be small out of necessity. And so everything up until this point, you can basically do with team members, your headcount, right? That's a committed piece, right? Partnerships, I've never, really had to pay for it from a startup because I was able to create that, right? Compelling trade-off. You do need substantial budgets for paid anything, SEM anything, because you're going to have to experiment. But if you do have budget and you do want to go there, and I would actually suggest that you don't start that too early and try to do some of the organic stuff, right? And SEO. You need to start with a premise, and you need to have your first couple of customers in so that what they responded to, like what were some of those messages, what did they care about. But if you're going to go there when you have budget and the time is right, think about your motion, right? Let's take Twilio and Segment. We were a developer first motion, right? Bottoms up motion. Think about the practitioner and really put yourself, that customer first mindset. What is it that the person, the practitioner is searching for? Like in our case, for Segment, right? If you do customer engagement, customer data platform, they have to actually know what that is, right? Those are really expensive keywords, right? What would they actually be searching for? Is it data API, right? So you're going to have to get very, very specific and avoid trying to own the largest category, because you're not going to be able to outpay the large. If you're disrupting a category, you're not going to be able to, outpay or outpace a larger company. So it's really, getting creative and getting to your customer in detail.
Certainly. Awesome. And folks, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A tab and we'll take them as we go along or at the end. But yeah, type your questions, hit Q&A and type your questions there. So let's dive into tools, resources, skill sets you need to have when getting started. Like, how do you build your team, your people, from maybe a small startup to growth stage, mid stage to scale?
Great question. I think early on, you're going to need generalists, right? Just really strong problem solvers. You may not need that deep expertise yet. You need somebody with a lot of breadth, right? Because you're trying to figure out what levers to double down on. I think the non-negotiables, though, at all stages is that relentless customer mindset. Your marketers need to be in front of customers. They need to be obsessed with understanding customers. And this sounds obvious, but I certainly don't take that for granted. And whether somebody in paid or just growth in general or demand marketers, the best team members I've hired, are constantly figuring out the psyche of who they're marketing to. There are other things that kind of come into play, like process always sounds a little boring, a little mundane, but and it's gotten better over the years. I think everyone's kind of already doing this, but how you mechanize, how you track your funnel is everything, right? If you don't have standard definitions, especially if you have a sales assisted motion and you're already there, you really need to make sure that your marketing process ties into your sales process. You have the right funnel definitions and that you're constantly tracking that, because you can't improve what you can't measure. And I think maybe, the third facet is, like the tool stack piece, right, Lloyd?
Yeah. Let's dive into that, the tools, and then also want to get your thoughts on what are some standard definitions that people should track and monitor and and keep on top of.
I think even before you go there, you have to agree on, or at least if you're really early on, experiment, what is your qualification process? right? Like what leads should you be following up on, right? And the standard is, okay, is it in the right time horizon? Do they have budget? Like that's very standard. And only if you have a clear understanding of how you want to qualify and that qualification you believe through experiments, right? You should always be iterating in the early days, actually leads to an accelerated deal close, right? Then you can say, okay, when I have a marketing qualified lead, what does that mean? A sales accepted lead, what does that mean? A sales qualified lead, and then an opportunity in all those stages, right? And I think these definitions are age old. I mean, they almost feel like dated terms, but the nuance is your qualification factors and how you do the qualification isn't necessarily correct or tied to, the speed of an opportunity close. And with that, I mean, you could be qualifying too lightly, and then sales is like, none of these are closable and we've wasted everyone's time. Or you're looking for the most perfect lead, which is unusual, but that does happen, right? Like I've seen companies where they're like, SDRs need to ask 40 questions before we move to sales, right? So yeah, so that's the part you need to figure out for your unique business.
Definitely. Let's say for you guys though, what is a marketing qualified lead mean? What does a sales qualified lead mean? And what is a sales accepted lead mean? Because maybe there's some nuggets here that people can leverage.
Yeah, we have a decently high bar, right? And we can afford to do so because we're a much larger business now. But marketing qualified leads obviously isn't just someone who fills out a form, right? We want somebody who's actually, we're a business to business business. So, we need a business email because it's too hard to chase somebody with a Gmail, right? But it's also somebody with the right title, because we know who the decision makers are. And these days, it's not just about lead qualification, it's also account qualification. So we couple that, right? And we say, okay, is it from these sets of accounts, tiered accounts that we care about? Because we know the quickest path to selling is across these industries, and that's where we want to focus. And when you get big, you can't service everyone. Like you surprisingly, you actually start focusing on certain industries. So that's our MQL. A sales accepted lead is okay, I make an initial contact that wasn't a fake phone number, right? That wasn't a fake email that somebody just put in, and they've agreed to try to set up a meeting. A sales qualified lead is, and sometimes this is where the opportunity starts, right? Is they've set up the meeting, SDRs have spoken to them, and they're like, hey, based on our qualification, like the timing, the budget, etc., guess what? I'm setting up a meeting with sales, then a true qualified opportunity. Sales meets and has that first sales meeting with them, and they're like, I agree to pursue this opportunity. It's a decently high bar, but we are sales assisted, and with PLG, it's a little different. Yeah.
That keeps it clean, right? Because a lot of the times marketing goes and does a webinar and gets like 500 people, 1,000 people, and throws it over the wall to sales, and sales goes through it, and like there's not even one qualified lead there. So what I heard is that there's some level of cleanup that's happening. There's some level of nurture that's happening. At what point do you pass the lead to sales?
We pass it when, we're lucky. We're a data-driven company. I have data scientists. We've built an algorithm, right? And so when these leads come through, that's what we're rating, right? We're like, hey, tiered account. Okay, great. Right title. Great. Right. Not a Gmail, Yahoo. Oh, nobody uses Yahoo anyway. I don't think. But not a non-business email. And then we pass it, right? So we're at least doing those basic checks. But the key for us is it an important account? Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, because you could throw hundreds of leads and then frustrate your salespeople, and they chase them and they get nothing out of it. So the nurture that you mentioned and the cleanup of the data to
Mhm.
make sure that they're relevant to the ICP is key here. Let's shift
Yeah.
gears to tools and tech stack. What is sort of non-negotiable or must-have in your tool stack, from like data collection to cleanup to workflow management end to end?
Yeah, you definitely need marketing automation, no surprise. You know, my go-to still after all these years, if you're a B2B business, it's Marketo. There are a couple of other tools that you can use, but I've been using Marketo for quite some time now. Um, if you're doing B2C marketing, and Hire was a two-sided marketplace, you know, on one hand, we were acquiring engineers to sign up for plan. On the other hand, it was businesses. For the B2C part, you know, there's also quite a few marketing automation, you know, software that you could use, but Iterable or Customer.io, you know, worked for us. You know, you obviously, if you are sales assisted, you will need a CRM. Salesforce is pretty much what everyone has. And then, you know, these days we should all have some type of product analytics tooling in your stack, right? So something like a mixed panel. And most of us are doing our reporting and our analysis in a slightly more sophisticated way, like the default reports don't work. So you're probably putting that into a database of some sort, right? Running your queries, and you're going to need something like Looker, right, to be that interface. And of course, in my line of business, right, you need to be instrumenting your customer data correctly, and ideally as a startup. Like we have the startup program where it's free when you're a startup, and it's putting in a customer data platform like Segment. You get to instrument your events over your web from the get-go so that you can reconcile the customer record in real time, and then you can move it, you know, to where you need. It allows you to be able to do audience segmentation in a very like discrete way. I have a little of a secret. I use something called Full Circle Insights, which does my attribution. It sits on top of Salesforce. I like the interface because it's almost as if you're just using Salesforce. They've done a really good job integrating, and it allows me to do attribution and therefore appropriate my budget. It allows me to get alignment with sales when I say, here's what's working. You may think this other tactic's working, but guess what? Here this is. And it's completely out, you know, within the sales workflow, right? To your point about workflow, the better alignment you can get is just, you know, make it a part of your stakeholders' workflow. And it's like invisible. It's not another app that somebody has to log into to look at. So that's my little secret, Full Circle Insights.
That is great. That's something that I hadn't heard of, so I'm going to use that. What is the best thing about Full Circle Insights? It gives you sort of end-to-end attribution, because I'll give you one example, right? So marketing today is, and growth and demand, whatever you want to call it, is super integrated, right? So let's say you do an offline event, but then you also have a community, then you do a few online events. But what ends up happening is a lot of startups, especially startup marketers, will do last touch attribution. Somebody came to the website, oh, the website drove traffic, but they don't realize that maybe that person also hopped on 2 webinars and listened to a few podcasts, engaged with some content. Does it give you sort of that, I guess, full circle picture, or like some sort of multi-touch attribution?
Yes, multi-touch. And ideally, you want to look at how your lead was sourced. Maybe it came in through an event, right? What touch actually happened right before an opportunity was open, and what touch after, you know, the last touch before it was closed. So that way you get 3 touches, and you can say, hey, events, because, you know, there's always perception, right? And sales can come to you, we want to do, they're very expensive to do. Usually ROI is not right? Like the highest, they're usually not the last touch. And is that a fair attribution? So especially when dollars, given beginning of this webinar and what you were talking about, when dollars are tight, you're going to have to get more precise and truly understand. So you're like, okay, events actually does really well sourcing leads. I'm not going to turn down that investment. But 9 out of 10 times, this type of content will help get an opportunity started. And guess what? This type of engagement means they're ready to buy. So it allows you to do so much more than last touch. The default in Salesforce is, CRM is last touch. This is, it's pretty cool. Yeah.
How do you though, let's say a lot of people, like community is all the rage in 2022, right? With third-party cookies being sunsetted in the next year, community can help you stand out, right? Ad ROI is going down. You can't add infinite number of SDRs. When you have a true community where members are interacting with each other or your community is interacting with each other. But the thing is, it's very hard to quantify the ROI because under community also comes events is a lot of, and offline being a part of it, online being a part of it, content being a part of it. How do you quantify the value of community? I mean, something like Full Circle, I guess, would help there.
Yeah, that would help there. Every touch should be set up as a campaign, right? And so if you're doing, I don't know, if for our community, we do a lot of things over Slack, right? And then we do a follow-up piece, right? But we specify in the campaign that this follow-up piece was especially designed for, a fireside chat that we had over Slack, whatever it might be. Yeah. But I agree with you, building a community and owning that relationship is the best way to go. I mean, that was so close to customer marketing in general. And this was many years ago where the push wasn't so much a community. They're like, build a customer community, but it's all the same, right? You're leveraging the voice of the customer and they are your biggest advocates. Yeah.
Certainly. Now, I want to take some audience questions here. There's a few here. Shashank asks, how much marketing effort should be put in towards the top of the funnel in comparison to mid-bottom?
Great question. It depends on what you need, right? Like if you don't even have enough pipeline, right? You're going to have to, and we actually have spreadsheets with models where we understand like how many leads we need, what that conversion is, so on and so forth. So let's just say you don't have enough pipeline, you got to fill the top of the funnel, right? And we have coverage ratios. We're like, okay, we've hit our pipeline goals already, and I try to front load everything at the beginning of the quarter. Well, guess what? Then I just like double down on the pipeline acceleration methods, right? Which include middle and bottom of the funnel tactics. But you got to like feed the funnel first, or, if you focus the middle, you're going to run out of pipeline. So it is, this very fluid concept of, bringing this up and then move it through. But you got to start with bringing it in, or you're not going to have enough pipeline to begin with.
Definitely. I mean, if you don't have a top of the funnel, then the mid bottom is like small numbers, right? I mean, the way we've done it at my other company at Boast is we know the ICP, we know the average revenue per customer, and we know the pipeline goals and targets for the end of the year. And at some point, you start to know your conversion ratios and you align effort accordingly, and then. Like you said earlier, if you break down your metrics measurement based on how many people am I bringing in the door, how many people are trying it, and then how many people are buying it, if you slice that, then you sort of know what pieces convert and what you need to drive to them to move from one phase to the other. Roberto asks here, any thoughts on the effectiveness on printed postcards to targets? What about good CTAs? I don't know if you guys do printed postcards.
No, we do a variation of that. We do send out gifts and gifting, right? That is not a top of the funnel tactic for me because that could get pretty expensive, right? We really use it as nurturing. It gets a little bit more tied to account-based marketing for our top tier accounts. maybe there's a VIP event that we're doing, right? And we're trying to get people to register. We send a gift, right? That seems to work really well. So I don't know if, printed postcards is kind of what you're referring to. If it's a consumer business, and you might be referring to that, if it's a consumer business, it really depends on the business and what you're driving to, right? Like, is your metric of success, are you looking to fill your funnel with just website demo requests, right? Or are you saying, hey, just, start a conversation with sales and not even look at the product? So it really depends. But, I think, Lloyd, when we were prepping, you had a question about like the greatest failures or whatever. And that happens to be, these postcards you send out and you try to offer an incentive for somebody to take a demo. And it's a nice little incentive, but, those tend to not work that well in my personal experience. Yeah.
Yeah, my biggest failure was the previous company. It was a calling app for salespeople. I created use this app and use it X times and get enrolled into a contest to go to Hawaii kind of thing. And it was like, I think
Yes.
$2,500 or $5,000 trip. And it completely bombed. So I'm not sure on that one, but let's take some questions here. Brooke asks, for B2B, what is the best way to market yourself, or you've seen, as a must-have or need-to-have software versus a nice-to-have app?
Oh, for must-haves. Well, the marketing stack is pretty hefty. So, some of the basics, right? You got to have a way to send out emails, right? So for B2B,
no,
that's
I think
okay.
I think she's asking, how do you position yourself as a must-have versus sort of nice-to-have? And I think that ties to your product more than the marketing, right? You can't just
sorry. I thought you meant like a stack. And yes. Oh, that is the age-old question, right? And what marketers we have to figure out. But I look at the problem that I'm solving for a customer, and how do I tie that problem for B2B to something that is a strategic initiative for companies overall, right? And so let me give you an example. When I started a Segment, the board came to me and said, oh my gosh, it's COVID. I started a few days after the true lockdown here in the Bay Area. So the board's like, we need to fix our messaging and what is our strategy, right? And at that point, I thought to myself, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know. This is nobody's experienced this. We're going to have to figure this out together. And what I did was my research, right? And at the time, I was listening to panels. I had a month to do this project, which is quite generous to come up with a response. But, I listened to a lot of these panels and everyone's like in survival mode. Nobody had enough data. And I then said, okay, with Segment, we are going to become your playbook for success, right? During these times that are heavily constrained and heavily, uncertain, right? Because digitally is the only way you can interact with your customers. And so we completely pivoted all of our messaging to, digital interactions and how you need a CDP to do so. So, I started listening to different companies' earnings calls, and I realized that, everyone was figuring out their own playbook for this new normal. And I needed to align to that. I needed to come up with our angle to help these companies. I looked for themes and I'm like, what is our angle? And a lot of it was just double down on digital transformation. We got to go.
Right. Definitely. Now, let me see if there's some other questions here. Shashank asks again, do you have any thoughts on intent-based marketing through reverse IP lookup tools And maybe Segment has a lot of partners, right? Because you're collecting data, but then a lot of the data might be unclean. You use something like a Clearbit to clean it up. How effective has that been?
It is effective. We do use Clearbit. We do use Bombora. I'm seeing the question. We don't use Funnel Beam. Those things are important, right? Intent-based marketing. But I will say that, if you can, right, the world is moving to, first-party data, but like certainly the third-party data where it's not compliant, feels a little icky to use, right? But if it's compliant data, that's probably okay. But yes, Clearbit and Bombora has worked for me, whether it was a Segment or at past companies.
Certainly. Now, Justin asks here, and he's leveraging ABM in a multi-motion environment, and you've worked in multi-motion environments throughout. What are some tactics that were most important in a multi-motion environment?
They're going to sound pretty straightforward and simple, but it truly worked for us. When COVID first hit, it was just really hard to, kind of engage. And we couldn't really do the really special VIP treatments and things like that. So what worked for us was simply doubling down on, this is a community play too, peer-to-peer learning at a VIP level, because everyone was trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I run my business in COVID? The world's shutting down. I have no idea when that's going to end. Like, what should I do? And so we were able to get a lot of traction in this one to few tactic. We also leveraged our most senior executives. This is Peter, co-founder and CEO. Tito at the time was our chief product and engineering officer. And we basically, for our top tier accounts, offered one-to-one consulting, right? It was like, one-to-one meetings with senior execs so that we could, solve this problem. Our one-to-many play, we worked with SDRs, and through Mutiny HQ, or maybe we should just call Mutiny now, we built very custom landing pages. It was a quick, easy, scalable way to build custom landing pages for the accounts that are going after that, our SDRs then ran their own workshops on. So yeah, so we really had to pivot pretty fast.
Mutiny, I hear, is a great product, right? For customizing your experiences. I'm gonna experience based on the ideal person that's showing up on the site. I'm gonna drop a link here as well. Awesome. So let's dive into Segment for a second, right? You started at Segment. What did your first 180 days look like? What did marketing look like? What did the team look like in the early days, and how did it evolve?
Good question. A lot of fast growing startups, get to a Series C, and then they go, oh my gosh, we were growing so fast. We took some shortcuts and we just needed to move fast, right? And so it was and I feel, I'm forever grateful to, Peter hiring me, because it was an opportunity of a lifetime. So I basically got to do some building and rebuilding to really shore up the engine and have it really scale. And now that we're a public company, I can't actually openly share these numbers, but, very few companies get acquired and like really overexceed, right, their revenue targets. And we certainly did. 1 year post-acquisition. But the net of it was, even foundationally, even being in the business of who we are, we needed to tune our instrumentation, right? Tune and do more measurement so we can actually see the ROI. And I turned on a lot of different tactics, and I turned on orchestration. Like, integrated campaigns is just, how do you orchestrate all of your different tactics so that they don't cannibalize, and in fact, they are amplifying. So, very tactically, those are some of the things that I had to do. From a team perspective, we really only had two sub-functions. It was demand generation and with a bunch of stuff nested underneath, and product marketing. For a whole host of reasons, I usually kind of break out my sub-functions a little bit more. And so I have content marketing kind of split out. So I still have demand gen, still have product marketing. I now have content marketing in a team. I have field marketing. I have ABM. I have enterprise, because you have to go really deep. And I also have what I consider, my ops arm, right? They do the numbers, they go do the research, they figure out what the market needs, right? And how to make that real. And I call it marketing strategy and planning.
Now you talked about, actually, I have a question here. What is, like, you talked about content marketing and all these roles. What does demand gen specifically do then in that? Because content can be demand. And then the second thing is you talked about orchestration, so it doesn't cannibalize with different campaigns. So maybe an example of that would be good as well.
Yes. So demand generation is, I have them doing the marketing stack, right? They actually get the campaigns out the door, right? So there's like email marketing, they figure out the nurture sequences, they take the content in and do that. And then they also do website optimization, right? All of our landing pages are request a demo page, and they also do paid. Oh, and organic SEO. So that is my demand gen. So I pulled content out from that because I think that's enough for the demand gen, session. And we just needed a really large team. And I have content in parallel to product marketing, but they report directly to me because sometimes I have to be the glue between product marketing and content as well. Yeah.
Certainly. The orchestration you talked about.
Yes. Yes. Oftentimes I see that companies, especially startups, they just send out a bunch of emails and, they do a bunch of webinars, and I see a bunch of tactics that just go out and they're like, here, check this out, check that out, check this out. To me, that's not quite integrated, right? Because what you want is every touch builds on top of the previous touch. And there's a reason why somebody is opening touch 1, right? As well as engaging with touch 2. So recently we did CDP week, which is, our version of our user conference. But we decided to lead with a category. So when we do this, right, like we're running a lead up to it. It may be content like, here's an ebook, here's a new topic. We're talking about third-party cookies versus first-party. Come to our event. So they're like, oh, it's relevant. First-party, third-party cookies. I need to understand that more. That's relevant. They click there. Then we're driving them towards an event, right? 3 days worth of, or 3.5 days worth of content. And there's panels or stuff that's really interesting. At the same time, we're launching a data report, right? State of personalization. And they're like, okay, here's more I want to learn, right? And then we follow that up with, product tours or, continue engagement. And had I done all 4 things separately by itself, it'll just feel like a spammy email. But because I've orchestrated that together, and sometimes our orchestrations are a lot, like I'm talking, 15, things that are firing off that make sense to the customer, you are able to grab their attention consistently. And then they're like, I learned a lot from this company. I didn't think about it that way. Maybe I should take that sales call. Yeah.
Certainly. Now, final question here, a couple of questions as we are at the top of the hour already. You're a startup, you've generated some leads, you got customers, you have product market fit, your demand gen is working basically. Maybe you're doing ABM, maybe you're doing events, maybe you're doing all of the above. How do you go from being the startup to a mega brand, which is a journey that Twilio made and Marketo made, and lots of people made that, but it's hard. How do you go from like collecting leads to sell a product to deliver value to then becoming a mega brand?
You have to create a movement. This is your community play. You have to create a movement that just is, a movement, a community that is just so excited about what you're offering to them. And it's kind of the network effect, right? It's, when I think about Salesforce, right, in the early days, it wasn't called Trailblazers yet. But think about where it's become. But literally, they're like, okay, we need a practitioner. Focus on the practitioner. We need that practitioner of loving the use of our product. Salesforce administrators, right? Every single company has one. This bottom-up motion, right? Like developers. Jeff's thesis was, if developers don't love your technology, why is there this technology? Because they're the ones that are so important. They need to love the product, right? It's delighting your customers. Segment the same way. Developers buy our product because they love how elegantly it was designed. And when I think about, other brands that kind of Atlassian, same thing, right? It was both a bottoms up motion as well as a top down. So it's really this groundswell that you're building and this community, right, that finds value in what you do and truly is delighted by your product.
Definitely. And I'm a big believer in that, building a community and the practitioner thing. You build this community of practice and you're falling in love with this practitioner and making them successful beyond the product or service. I often say, if you build a community, right, you won't become a commodity. If you look at Gainsight is a perfect example. Customer success as an industry didn't really exist 10, 12 years ago. There were maybe like,
that's right,
I don't know, 20, 30 people with that title. And they create all this content around making professionals in that field successful. They created a movement around, hey, customer support is reactive. You got to really understand your customers and make them successful before they have a problem. And how do you be proactive support? And they provided all this content and build a movement and community. So yeah, that is great advice. And I think this is the year of the community building and
right,
and loving your practitioners, because with cookies and all these things that you could spend money on, third-party data going out, your relationships are what will hold you for life. What's your favorite campaign over your career?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? A huge believer of B2H, business to human, whether I'm buying, something really nice and fun and pretty on my Instagram feed to me buying business software. I think it is about building that true, authentic connection with your audience, with your customer, your future customers. And we at Hired had access to salary data. Every engineer that took an offer off of our platform, we had that information. And so every year, for multiple years in a row, we would publish an equal pay day report based on not survey data, actual data. And we took the liberty one year to get a lot more creative. Instead of just a panel and trying to get people to come listen, put up our speakers. I commissioned at the time Facebook's resident artists, and I had her take our data and create life-size, art installation art, and basically had it in a museum space down the dog patch. And I created a week-long event. And I did, ABM roundtables during the day. Every single marketer was a docent. It was a conversation piece. It's hard to actually do press dinners these days. We had a press dinner underneath, right? We had our top customers come in and still do that business panel. We had community leaders, right, and nonprofits that were rallied behind this, right? So it was so much more than just winning business. It was bringing awareness to the issue and the subtlety of, higher spontaneous was a brand lift. and I also get that question, like, how do you do, branding and get ROI? Well, you got to tie it in as part of your integrated campaign. Highest converting ever, right? Highest converting campaign ever. And, humble brag, we actually won a few awards for it. So, one of our top customers, they're like, was it $1 million to run that? I'm like, no, not even close. It's like 150K. So you can actually do really, creative, interesting things like that when you think about what appeals to humans versus even to just, business and stuff, the business mindset. So yes, that was my favorite campaign over my career.
Awesome. And, doing good things that get a lot of word of mouth doesn't need budget always. Like if you look at early days of Salesforce, he held up signs with say no to software and went to other big conferences with those signs.
That's
and
right.
A lot of word of mouth and PR spun from these stunts. How does the audience follow you? What social channels are you active on?
On Twitter, at Catch with a K for Katrina, Catch Me Social. And I'm also, part of the business world. I'm quite, I will get back to most people on LinkedIn. So those are the two main channels.
Fantastic. It's been a great session. What a pleasure. I learned a ton. Thank you so much for joining us. Wishing you great success, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. Thank you for having me.
And folks, the session will be on our YouTube channel and on our podcast. So stay tuned for that. All recordings are always here. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
I need some traction.